Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Today is Wednesday, August 3rd, 2022. And of course, the time is flying by. We've got tons of news to go over today. I think one of the more interesting pieces of news today, though, has to do with Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. And I'm writing about this today. It'll be up by the time that you see this podcast. But I think that there are some really interesting nuances going on here in the public commentary as to whether or not Sinema is going to come on board the Manchin-Schumer reconciliation agreement. And Sinema herself this morning says she's taking her time. She's not going to commit. She's waiting for the parliamentarian to do the bird bath on the reconciliation bill. All of that is true. We've known that for a while. What is interesting, though, is what The Hill reported late yesterday as to what's going on between Manchin and Sinema. They mentioned that Manchin finally got a chance to meet with her face-to-face on the Senate floor. They've been exchanging texts, been exchanging documents. This is the part that I found very interesting. Manchin was tight-lipped about the details of the conversation, The Hill says, but made clear that he's willing to consider changes she might want to make to the deal. Now, this is already in front of the parliamentarian. The deal is already in front of the parliamentarian. So how do you make changes to the deal? You'd have to go back and put it in front of the parliamentarian with any changes. Plus, you'd have to get Schumer to sign on to it. You'd have to really open negotiations up all over again. Now, that suggests to me that Sinema has a substantial disagreement with this package, and I think we know what it is. It's the carried interest tax change that creates a lot of revenue by changing the interest rate on changing the tax rate on carried interest from capital gains to normal income. It's a much higher rate when you do that. And so I think that this is part of a large part of the $730 billion that gets raised in this package. So if you take that out, you got to replace it with some other sort of revenue. Otherwise, it doesn't go into balance and it's not a reconciliation bill anymore. So if Manchin's still talking about negotiating the terms of the deal, this thing looks like it might be actually going off the rails. And I've been skeptical about this. I didn't think Sinema would torpedo this, but it sounds like she's seriously at least opposing some of this deal. So that's something to keep in mind. Doesn't mean in the end that she won't go along with it. There's going to be a lot of pressure on her to do that, and it's going to be a big issue in the midterms in terms of her party's track record as to whether or not they pass this type of stuff. And Sinema obviously is very interested in the climate change portions of this deal. But man, I'm telling you, this has been over a week now, and Sinema's not on board, and Manchin's talking about renegotiating. That's not a good sign for Manchin, for Schumer, or Joe Biden. And so that's one big piece of news I think that may be a little buried under some of the other stuff that is doing. Otherwise, we're talking a little bit about what happened in yesterday's primaries. I've got another piece that's going to go up this afternoon about what the referendum vote in Kansas means for the midterms. Dick Durbin thinks it means that there's going to be a big, massive pro-choice turnout in the elections. Philip Bump at the Washington Post is skeptical, as am I. This was a one-off ballot choice in regards to a specific policy. We'll get into more of that later on today. Joe Biden, by the way, is going to be issuing an executive order on abortion access, interstate abortion access. He's going to ask Medicaid to fund some of those expenses for women who are crossing interstate lines to get abortions. That is going to run afoul of the Hyde Amendment, something I point out, and that'll be up later on today. All the pundits got a look at the Arizona results as well, and he's also got something coming up on Peter Meyer's defeat in Michigan and their Aiken strategy there. I keep an eye out for that. And I have, just on a personal basis, I've got my own obituary up for the late, great Vin Scully. And I hope you read it. I didn't write it to get a ton of page views. I wrote it to just sort of put this out there. But, I was blessed with good role models. I had a good father, I had good uncles. I mean, there was no shortage of role models for me, but Vin Scully was one of them. And Vin Scully he wasn't a preacher, he wasn't a lecturer. It was just the way he did his job and the gentle way in which he approached it, the honest way he approached it, the inclusive way he approached it, and always with this very gentle personal touch. I'm going to miss him. And I think a lot of people are going to miss him who grew up listening to him, who understood what fair play and sportsmanship and graciousness was on the basis of listening to him and watching him do his job day in, day out, for an organization he loved and an organization he was tremendously loyal to. And we're just not going to see his like again for lots of different reasons. Not because those values don't exist, in part because of technology. I mean, we just simply don't consume sports in the same way that we used to when Vin Scully was broadcasting for 67 years. 67 years as a broadcaster, longest stretch of a team broadcaster in history. I think we're just really going to miss a very, very good man in Vin Scully. So I hope you get a chance to read that. And I hope that if you had those experiences with Vin Scully, that hopefully it at least speaks to the experiences that you had as well. And I would also recommend, by the way, going over to redstate.com to my colleague Jennifer Van Laar's own personal remembrances of Vin Scully. She actually goes on a little bit longer length than I do. It's a really beautiful remembrance of Vin Scully too. So if you get a chance, do that as well. In the meantime, today's episode is going to feature two people that we've talked to in the past, Brant, Hadaway, and Leslie Manookian. They're challenging, they successfully challenged the CDC's mask mandate on transit. The CDC and the DOJ are appealing that decision, and Brant Hadaway filed their response to the appeal on Monday. And we arranged to speak with him and Leslie Manookian. She's the lead plaintiff in this from the Health Freedom and Defense Fund. And we spoke, I think we actually speak for like close to 40 minutes about what's going on, what's at stake. And it's important to know that this is going to go beyond the mask mandate. This is really targeting the heart of agency law. So stay tuned. It's a great conversation. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. Joining us on the Ed Morrissey Show podcast today are two of our guests who have been here before, and they've also been in front of court before. They're going to have to do it all over again because the CDC and the Department of Justice just can't take no for an answer. Joining us today, Brant Hadaway from the Davalier Law Firm, formerly Strange Women Lying in Ponds, a great blog from back in the day, and Leslie Manookian from the Health Freedom Defense Fund. She's the president and founder of Health Freedom Defense Fund, the plaintiff in this case, healthfreedomdefense.org, talking about mask mandates. And Brant and Leslie, why are we here? This is not a popular measure. It's not an effective measure. The pandemic, even the whatever excuse there was for this, has pretty much gone by. And yet they're appealing the win that you got in the district court. I guess we'll start with Brant. What? Did they want to make you a wealthy man? Is that what the deal is here?
Yeah, one can only hope. One of the things I said back, I think when we spoke immediately after Judge Meisel's ruling, was that there was the part of her order on the statutory authorization was undoubtedly giving CDC and the administration a great deal of heartburn, because even if they don't want to reimpose the mask order, they want to have the power to do something like this in the future, right? And so this is really a fight about the authority of the administrative state. It's kind of just another battle in that bigger fight that's going on over the current constitution of the court and their retreat from Chevron deference, which for the audience is a case, this decision of the Supreme Court from the 1980s that said, well, if there's a statute that one could interpret either way, courts will defer to an agency's reasonable interpretation because that is what the agencies are charged with doing by Congress. And so it really respects the separation of powers to give the agencies the leeway to interpret that. Of course, that it presumed that successive administrations would enforce the law in good faith. And what we've had since is that we've had increasingly radical interpretations of law where successive administrations are picking and choosing, uh, like looking for obscure provisions in a statute and then saying it authorizes them to take some sort of executive action that is completely unprecedented. And we've seen this numerous times. And in his recent concurrence in the Supreme Court case of West Virginia versus EPA, Justice Gorsuch actually referred to this as, quote, pen and phone legislation by the executive branch. And that is really what this is all about. It's about pen and phone legislation, and it's about the increasing inability to even agree on what words mean, which should be a foundational sort of prerequisite for formulating public policy. But if we can't even agree on the meaning of words, then how can agencies be entrusted with that sort of discretion?
Right. Now, Leslie, you're the plaintiff. You're the lead plaintiff on this. President and founder of Health Freedom Defense Fund, healthfreedomdefensefund.org. Again, that's where you can find Leslie and all the fine work that they're doing over there. This really is the fight you want, right? Because what you want to do is you want to take on the administrative state and push back against the federal government and its intrusion in healthcare matters and just simply, everyday life. And so this is really the fight that you're looking to have.
I think it's really important for people to understand that, as long as you're going along with the flow, as long as you're doing what a doctor tells you or the CDC tells you, then there's no reason to push back, right? They don't understand, a lot of people, even why this isn't so important. But if you've had a reaction to a drug, or you've had a reaction to a injection, a vaccination, if you have chosen to use holistic medicine or something that is outside of the scope of conventional medicine as your primary healthcare, then these things really matter to you, because you see what happens when institutions and government are weaponized in support of private industry. So what we see happening all over the country is that the Federation of State Licensing Boards, which are the group that actually licenses doctors in individual states, are dictating to doctors what they can and can't say. That's a problem, right? This is all about government overreach in all of its guises. And so Health Freedom Defense Fund and I personally am very, very committed to fighting back against intrusions into my private decisions about how I keep myself well, how I keep my family well. And the mask mandate that was issued by CDC, let's be really clear, a year after
right,
the whole thing started. It wasn't like CDC was claiming that they needed to issue this mask mandate right early on in the crisis. It wasn't until Joe Biden took office that the CDC issued this order. And my point is that people may not care, they may not realize the importance of this, but those who try and choose a path that might be slightly different from the mainstream, those people really care. And now millions of Americans are waking up and realizing that everybody should care, because if the CDC can force you to don a medical device or literally it's a garment when it's just a piece of cloth,
right,
then CDC has way, way too much power. And so yes, Health Freedom Defense Fund is hell-bent on protecting our enumerated rights and those that aren't enumerated in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Because, let's remember, it's supposed to be a restraint on government, not on us.
And coming back to you again on this, Leslie, because it would be one thing if these were actually effective policies, right? It still would be intrusive. It still would be worthy of challenging, because put simply, the Congress did not grant the CDC this kind of authority. We're going to talk a little bit with Brant about that in just a moment, because it was the basis of your win at district court in Florida. It's going to be the basis of the appeal, plus a new argument that I'm just itching to discuss with Brant here in just a second. But even if these were effective policies, this isn't the way to go about it. But these aren't even effective policies. You mentioned cloth masks. Most people are wearing disposable surgical masks, which are not effective at what it is that they're supposed to be trying to do. For the most part, yeah.
Can I just say, even N95s are not effective either? But go ahead, ask your question.
You're right. I was just about to say, they're the most effective mitigation masks that you can wear, but most people don't wear them properly. They don't keep them on their face because they're uncomfortable as hell. And so they don't actually do the job either. And so some of this is certainly constitutional issues and major questions, doctrine and all that. But a lot of this is also the fact that the reason why we have those safeguards against overreach in government is because oftentimes it just imposed bad policies or nonsense policies, and the CDC mask mandate happens to be one of those.
Ed, when Brant was first speaking and he was talking about all the problems and the way that we can't agree on language anymore, one of the things I think is so important to remember is that government only works when people are well-intentioned who are in government. Yeah. And our laws also assume that these federal agencies have good intentions. And I'm not so sure that we could all count on that. I think that is highly suspect at this point. When CDC completely ignores its own meta-analysis of, I think it was 14 studies that it produced, it published in May of 2020, which showed that these masks don't do anything for the flu. You have to seriously question their intentions when they're now all coming out and revising history over the last couple of years, saying that, Deborah Birx has come out saying that she never, ever thought that the vaccines would prevent transmission or infection. When Fauci is now backtracking, saying that he never supported lockdowns. I mean, this is a real crisis, right? I mean, I believe that what we're experiencing is a true constitutional crisis, and that we are not in a place where we have people who are necessarily worthy of our trust. And the thing is, when there are people who are not worthy of our trust guarding the hen house, you're going to have major problems. And I think that's what we face. So yes, these masks are absurd. And they're being put on people, forced on people who are not even known to be sick.
Right.
Who are not known to be a problem or a danger or a threat to anybody. And so, I mean, I think it's so multifaceted. It's so much more complex than just do masks work or not, and does the CDC have constitutional authority? It's this huge, mosaic of issues which really come down to who owns our bodies, who gets to decide, and even if CDC says something, should I trust them? I think most Americans don't trust them at this point.
Yeah, Leslie, I think it's a great point. And I want to take it back to Brant here, because one of the things that you mentioned is it dovetails exactly into what Brant was talking about, which is the Chevron doctrine, which was based on the idea, Brant, that agencies were working in good faith on these types of interpretations of the statutes and how they could write regulations around them. The Chevron doctrine assumes good faith. And I think one of the reasons why it's breaking down now is because it's been pretty clear. Well, I would say it assumes good faith and it assumes expertise. And I think the reason why Chevron is under attack and is likely to get tossed at some point entirely is that nobody can prove the expertise, but there's a lot of evidence about bad faith in these attempts based on the fact of the manipulation of language like you're talking about.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate legacy of Chevron, which we actually mentioned in a footnote to our brief, is that it has tacitly encouraged successive administrations to engage in more and more radical departures from statutory meaning and statutory purpose. And it's really veering us in the direction of becoming a banana republic, whereas Chevron was, at least part of the intent, was to encourage regulatory stability and predictability. We now have a situation where investors, in important sensitive industries like the energy industry, they have to consider things that investors used to think about when investing in third world countries, which is regime uncertainty, regulatory instability, this sort of arbitrary and capricious nature of changing regimes and having a new regime come in and say the law is something completely different from what the previous regime said it was. And that is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. And it's not just, the Department of Education sending out letters saying that, redefining the meaning of woman under Title IX. It comes down to very fundamental things that affect our lives and affect our economy, and that is what I think really dooms Chevron, is that aspect of what we're seeing.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily sure I'm a big fan of deference to agency authority anyway. I'm not sure how Chevron came about, but however it came about, I think the sooner it ends, the better. And the sooner that we hew to the actual written word and the commonly understood definitions of those written words, the better off we're going to be, because that in itself will just introduce a lot more stability, and it will force Congress to do more of its job, right? Which is to say, well, look, I mean, if you've got gaps in the statutes, well, then Congress has to fix those gaps. It shouldn't be up to agencies just simply make assumptions that work around those gaps. It's up to Congress to do their jobs, right, Brant?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of it, and Gorsuch has said that. Other judges, I believe Kavanaugh has mentioned that factor as well, that we've really taken the onus off of Congress. And there's a reason why the powers of Congress are in Article 1 of the Constitution, because the framers regarded that as the most important power of the federal government was to be in Congress. But we've increasingly placed so much emphasis on the executive, and so many people freak out about who's going to be the next president. And my response to that is, well, if you're freaking out about who has the next president, it might be because we've given the executive too much power over the years.
Yep.
And we need to return that to Congress, because the whole framework of the Constitution was designed to encourage broad consensus, that we wouldn't have these sort of lurching changes like, you're like you feel when you're on a train on a bad railroad track, when you're being jerked from side to side. This sort of ability to reach broad consensus is taken away when we have so much deference to agency interpretations that things can turn on a dime, like we've seen in recent years with this, as Gorsuch put it, pen and phone legislation from the executive.
Right, which was go ahead, Leslie.
I just wanted to chime in on this because I think there are two major issues at play here that are really important to unpack. One of them is that there's this notion, right? It's the nanny state. It's that government is this great authority, that government should be telling us what to do and we should defer to government. And I mean, I have to confess, there was a time in my life when I thought that the only thing that was wrong in the world is that I didn't pay enough taxes, and that if government just had more money, everything would be okay. I really did.
Yeah, I think a lot of us went through that phase too.
I've had firsthand experience listening to CEOs of multinational corporations talk about how they're going to literally kill people with their new drug, but they'll still do billions and billions in sales because, it's only a few people who will die. There's an incredibly cavalier attitude amongst many of these CEOs. But my biggest point is that government has taken this place where too many average citizens think that government is above the law, and government is the authority to which they should defer. And I think that's part and parcel of another thing, which is the second point that I wanted to make, and that is the cult of the expert, right? So we have been conditioned to defer to doctors and scientists. Why do you think they wear white lab coats? It's because it conveys authority, right? It conveys position and power. Why are they called doctors when no other professionals get to be called some title? It's because it cultivates this superiority, that they hold a higher place and that they are above reproach. And I think it is high time that Americans woke up and started challenging all of these notions. The cult of the expert is one of the biggest problems, and it's at play with respect to these agencies dictating to us. It's what's at play with the federal government dictating to us, which the president having too much power. And the truth is that all of these entities can be bought, they can all be captured, and they can be used against us. So if I want to use vitamin C or a homeopathic product instead of a jab for my health, I should be able to. That should be my choice. That should be my right. And nobody in government, nobody who's unaccountable, nobody who is not me should be able to make those choices. And so I think that's what we're really suffering from, is this kind of deference to government, and also this cult of the expert, which has been carefully crafted over many, many decades. Think about that. Do you guys remember the cigarette ads? My brand is Camel, right?
Right.
In the white lab coat, the doctors were saying, my brand is Camel. I mean, it was all about cultivating this sense of authority amongst them. And I think it's really destructive.
Well, and Leslie, this goes back to Woodrow Wilson. You know, this, I mean, and Brant, you can feel free to chime in on this. We'll take a very short dive into the philosophical here and into some con law history here. But the agency state is not the natural state of being in the United States, or at least it's not the historical natural state of being in the United States. It really started in during the Wilson administration, where Wilson sort of conceived this idea that government of experts beats government of elected representatives. And this was an explicit part of Wilson's progressivism. Wilson was one of the progressives of the early 20th century. And the idea that experts knew better and should really dictate to Americans how they live their lives. And this starts with Wilson, kind of takes a little bit of a break in the 1920s, and after the Depression and New Deal, it just accelerates through all sorts of different things. And that's when you have this explosion of agency law, which is really Congress surrendering a lot of its legislative authority to the executive branch. And certainly they still have some oversight over it, but that's how we ended up in this position. And that's what Leslie's talking about, Brant, is that leads us to this point where you get to a CDC that thinks it can dictate human behavior just on the basis of they're the experts and we're not.
Yes, indeed. And, you know, the funny conundrum that's sort of at the heart of the administrative state, and you bring up Wilson, the underlying philosophy, you know, from the Wilson era was that this sort of government of expertise was going to give us greater continuity and greater stability in how we lived our lives. And what Wilson failed to anticipate was that agencies, you know, you would create this monstrous sort of bureaucratic state that would end up being highly partisan, or at least subject to the partisan whims of whatever administration was in power. And so it ended up giving, ironically or not, it ended up giving the executive branch enormous amounts of power that you know would have been inconceivable prior to Wilson. Maybe that was his point. Maybe it wasn't. But that's where we are, in that whatever they was being sold to the public back at the time about having greater continuity and stability in terms of regulation, you know, and being less subject to the partisan swings of government, we've ended up with the complete opposite. We've ended up, you know, like I said earlier, we ended up becoming something more like a banana republic in the way that agencies are weaponized. Especially by the left. I mean, we saw it during the Obama administration weaponizing the IRS and other agencies against anybody who got out of line. And we're seeing, you know, the EPA weaponized against, for example, SpaceX. And we're seeing, you know, other agencies weaponized against people who are sort of threats. It's almost a Soviet outlook that anybody who becomes too much of a threat as an independent power center, like an Elon Musk or somebody, has to be hammered down. And the weaponization of agencies against people has become a huge problem. And it's become like the golem, you know, the you know, or Frankenstein's monster in a sense.
Yep. You know, not least of these, I mean, I don't know if you're aware of this, Ed, but this is truly staggering what's happened. It's been revealed in recent months that the CDC paid the media $1 billion in the last couple of years to only convey the official narrative to the American people. Okay.
Yep.
But they went much further than that, though. they didn't only give media the money to the media. They also actually colluded with big tech. This has now been released in documents that were released last week through FOIA, that they were actually colluding, making lists of people to take off of social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. They were colluding with big tech and violating Americans' First Amendment rights.
Yep.
This is truly staggering. I mean, I know there was a case against Facebook a couple of years ago, and the judge said, oh, don't worry about it. Or the judge actually at the time said, oh, come on, the government is not colluding with big tech. The government, there's no evidence that the government was collaborating with Facebook. There's no evidence of that. Well, now these documents have been FOIA'd because the White House was actually saying that they were meeting with big tech, and that they were collaborating on what the messaging should be, what was appropriate messaging, what was misinformation. Now there's actually evidence of this, and we are going to be filing a First Amendment case in the not too distant future, HFDF, against CDC and one of the big tech, because there is absolute black and white evidence now that they have been colluding, and they haven't just been colluding, they've been meeting, they've been paying them and colluding. Now, this is government gone literally awry, right? It's run amok. When our government is colluding with private industry in order to dictate what an American can say or can't say, we are literally at the end of the rope. I mean, we truly are a banana republic, to borrow Brant's characterization of the situation.
All right, Brant, I think at this point in time, we got to get back to this brief, and because I promised the audience a really fun argument that is brand new to in your brief. Now, this is an appellate brief, and Leslie and I were talking about this before we turned the recording on, and it's a fun argument. Appellate briefs really do primarily recap what happened at the district court level and recap the case. I'm sure that the CDC's brief here in this case is going to do something similar. And of course, they also try to expand on it and make the case stronger. And you actually have a pretty good hypothetical in here based on the idea that the CDC can somehow regulate human activity as part of its sanitation clause. I'm not even going to read this. I'm just going to let you describe it because it's your brief, man, and you get the glory here.
A big part of the fight here is over the interpretation of Section 361A of the Public Health Service Act of 1944. And if anybody wants to look it up, it's encoded at 42 United States Code, Section 264A. You can go and look it up there. And it has two sentences. And the first sentence basically says the Surgeon General, which is a duty that's been conferred to the CDC over the years, has the authority to institute, regulations reasonably designed to prevent the interstate or spread of disease, the spread of disease from foreign countries into the states, or the spread of disease from state to state. And there's a second sentence that says, in doing those, the Surgeon General may do things like order inspection, fumigation, disinfection, sanitation, and so on. Now, going back to, you'll remember under the Trump administration, there was the eviction moratorium that
Right.
CDC instituted this rule. And CDC had never done anything to rule over our daily lives or reach so deeply into the national fabric or the economy. CDC was generally an agency that was known for providing advice and assistance to the states and local governments in public health. And where it governed people's lives at all, it was to enforce quarantine at ports of entry to the United States. But even that function has really gone very much in the background. We don't have, they long ago ceased having things like mass quarantine, like, where you arrive at Ellis Island and you're sent for inspection and
like the scene from The Godfather 2, where they put him in for 3 months. Yeah,
exactly. They long ago ceased doing that, but remember, this statute was written in 1944, and so you have to think about, most people coming in the country, they're coming in by ship and so forth. And so, what do these words mean? And the district judge looked at the words and said, well, CDC urged that sanitation should have a broad meaning of things pertaining to public health. And the district judge said, well, you got to look at the statutory context. And one of the things she did was you look at these other words: inspection, fumigation, disinfection. These are active measures that you would do to a thing or an object, not to a person. And so these sanitation must mean some sort of active cleaning measure that you would apply to a property or a thing, not to a person. And in their argument on appeals, CDC again goes back to that argument that you can pick and choose from any number of dictionary definitions. And there was an amicus brief was filed on behalf of CDC by a group of public health law experts. They're all leftists, and they provided this laundry list of possible definitions of sanitation, and all of them are very broad and amorphous. So just and it's the same thing. If that's the definition, then CDC could take almost any public health measure just based on the word sanitation, saying, well, it's a sanitation measure. And in one paragraph, I suggest that perhaps as a sanitation measure, CDC could require condoms, or perhaps it should just order a moratorium on all intimate human contact until it gets the monkeypox outbreak under control. By CDC's reasoning, by this sort of notion that you can define sanitation in a manner that's completely untethered from its statutory context, that's the sort of thing you get. Now, maybe somebody would say, well, that's an absurd sort of hypothetical, but part of the point of arguments on appeal are to educate the judges on what absurd lengths the reasoning of the other side could take you to.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there's absolutely nothing to stop CDC from going on that sort of rationale at all, based on what it's arguing vis-a-vis the meaning of the word sanitation.
Well, right. I mean, is it a reductio ad absurdum? Yeah, but it's not necessarily all that reductio, because and Leslie's already chiming in here in agreement. The mask mandate itself is sort of a reductio ad absurdum in and of itself, and it's actually in place, Leslie. So, I mean, this is the reason why the statute doesn't anticipate having bureaucrats dictate to people their own personal behavior. I mean, that's a line that shouldn't have gotten crossed in the first place.
100%. Well, first of all, it's really important to bear in mind that CDC never argued that masks were a sanitation device in the very beginning. When they implemented the mask order, they never said that. It was only after the fact, after we filed our lawsuit and we got the ruling, and then they wanted to, then I forget at which juncture, Brant, you can remind me. But yeah,
it was when the Supreme Court came down with its decision in Alabama Association of Realtors. That was an eviction moratorium case. The Supreme Court said that the scope of the first sentence is informed by the words in the second sentence, and I forgot to mention that. And it was only after that ruling came down, which was shortly after we filed our lawsuit, the CDC came in and seized on that word sanitation as a post hoc rationale for the order.
Yep.
Yeah, so they're just trying to cover their butts, right, after they've already done something which seems pretty egregious. So that's one thing that I think bears remembering. But the other thing is, Mike Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York City, he tried to, by executive order, dictate that New Yorkers couldn't drink big gulps.
I remember that very well.
32 ounce. I don't know how much is in a big gulp. I've never had a big gulp. I think
it's a 44. I think it's a 44 ounce soft drink or something.
Some absurd amount of high fructose corn syrup, right? I mean,
right. Well, when I was a teenager, it was great. I'm not a teenager anymore, so I wouldn't even try something like that. But yeah, exactly.
Nobody in their right mind would want to drink that unless they were maybe a teenager. But the point is that he tried to do this, and it was struck down as, a violation of his power and authority. The court said, sorry, no go, Mike. And I think it's a great illustration of this overstep of government. And if you take CDC's interpretation of sanitation, what's to stop them from dictating what we can and can't eat? How much ice cream can you have? Can you eat a candy bar? And the reason I'm arguing that is because we know scientifically that sugar undermines the immune system. So are they going to dictate that?
Yeah.
How far are they going to go? Are they going to tell us how much exercise we have to get every single day or every single week? Where is it going to end? And is it somehow connected to what your genetic composition might be? Like, are you more inclined to get diabetes or to have heart disease? And, the government gets it wrong all the time. I mean, for decades, we were told that fat is bad for us, saturated fat. And now they're admitting that actually butter is good for you, right? Saturated fat from healthy pastured animals, whole milk, raw milk in particular, is good for you. And so, the point is that it's so easy for them to get out over their skis, right? To get way, way out in front of where they should be. And this is about politics. It's not about science. It's not about public health. It is clearly about political power, and that's it. And I think it's incumbent upon every person to actually consider these sort of absurd examples, because you never know where they're going to go with any of these things. And that's how you really see what the true sort of, if you take it to its end conclusion, where that might end up. And I think we don't want to forget about that.
Well, right. And Brant, I mean, so you filed the brief. So that's the fun's over. Now you got to do the waiting until you get in front of the appellate court. Do we know when the appellate court is going to take this up, or?
We'll have to see whether they schedule oral argument. I expect that they will. They don't have to. There's going to be a number of amicus briefs filed on our side, including, I would anticipate, one from a number of states, including the state of Florida. Those should drop on Monday. There have already been a couple of amicus briefs filed as of today, but we'll see if and when the 11th Circuit schedules oral argument, and then we'll take it from there and see what happens. But I get the feeling that the administration would prefer that there not even be a ruling before the midterms, because really, when you think about it, either way this goes is going to be bad political news for them before the midterms. Because if they win a reversal, then the news cycle is, oh my gosh, they're going to put you back in mass. If they lose, then it's, well, what did you do that for? And so I think one of the reasons they've been kind of not in a hurry to get a ruling here is that.
Honestly, and I'll make this the last question. Both of you can answer it, but I think it's a little bit more towards Brant. I don't even understand the strategy here, because if you lose at the district court, you've just lost in one court. Mm-hmm. And you can just wait until you actually think that you need to do something before you challenge it, or just issue a different order and let it be challenged again, right? Mm-hmm. This is going to set a precedent, at least in the 11th Circuit, that isn't set yet. Right. And if it gets pushed to the Supreme Court, it's going to settle this question once and for all, and likely on the terms of the Alabama Association of Realtors case when it comes to the eviction. It's probably going to be 9-0 if it gets that far. I don't even understand what the hell the strategy is here. They'd be better off politically and legally just walking away from this one and wait for the next thing to pop up.
I thought that the smart play politically would have been to end the mask mandate before Judge Mizell had a chance to rule.
Right.
And then I would have been arguing with DOJ about mootness and capability of repetition type arguments. And, that could have gone either way. But, by leaving it hanging out there and giving a court a chance to rule on this when they knew they had to know that their arguments were kind of shaky, struck me as politically not so intelligent. But I think I mentioned to you the first time we talked about this was that I learned from somebody inside DOJ that nobody outside DOJ actually knew about this case before it blew up. And so it caught the administration completely flat-footed, and then you had this finger pointing, and then you had this kind of thing, well, who's going to make the decision? And it was all a big mess. But it's just par for the course with this administration. It's just, I've seen nothing like it in my lifetime.
Yeah.
I think can we say though, maybe that it's just par for the course for government? I mean, isn't that really what the issue is? Because here's what's so interesting. we file, we win. We win on April 18th. You would think that if there were an emergency, they would fight back right away. They would try and overturn the ruling immediately. They'd try and expedite the process. They did none of that.
Yeah, they didn't seek a stay, which it became obvious within the first couple of days that they weren't terribly serious about fighting this and trying to snap back the policy. And I think they knew because it was political poison. I mean, everybody saw the viral videos online of people celebrating. And that was, how do you walk that back? I mean, to me, it was like the same sort of preference cascade that we almost like what we saw in 1989, with the wall coming down. Just
right.
People were so happy. What are you gonna bring back unhappiness now? And
exactly.
So
this is about the preservation of the nanny state. That's all this is about. It's a preservation of the nanny state. They see this as an existential threat to the edifice of the nanny state, and that's what Leslie Manookian's been arguing all along. That's what Brant Hadaway is also arguing in court, and that's what you have to be paying attention to, folks. This is a case that you're going to want to stay on top of, and thankfully Brant and Leslie have been so generous with their time and keeping us informed here at Hot Air. And I know that we're going to talk more as this case continues to progress. And Leslie Manookian is at Health Freedom Defense Fund. That's healthfreedomdefense.org. And I think, Leslie, you're on Twitter, right?
We have a social media presence. You can find all of our social media by going to our homepage, healthfreedomdefense.org. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a smart way to do it.
Well, we're on social media, but we are seriously suppressed. I'll tell you that. Whenever someone tries to join our Facebook page or our Instagram page, they get a warning saying that this channel has been flagged and that it shares questionable content and things like this, which is just bogus. I mean, we share science, we share the law, but it's a good example of how bad things are for those of us trying to, portray a different perspective.
And it's just another piece of evidence for your next court case, Leslie Manookian. You can find out more about that at healthfreedomdefense.org. So stay tuned on that. And of course, Brant Hadaway, friend of mine from way back in the blogosphere, doing some fine work in court. You can find him at davilierlawgroup.com. That's DAVILLIER lawgroup.com. And that's where he's doing a lot of his work. He doesn't do strange women lying in ponds, darn it, anymore. But I'm going to try to talk him into it at one point here. I mean, when he's done winning all these fights, because he's going to win them all, we'll get him back. We'll get him back in the blogosphere. Brant Hadaway, Leslie Manookian, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having us, Ed.
Yeah, thanks, Ed.
Always good to see you.
Always good to see both of you. Stay tuned for more from the Ed Morrissey Show coming up next. This is Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com for Town Hall. Will she or won't she? After Joe Manchin and Chuck Schumer finally cut a deal on reconciliation, all eyes have turned to Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who had also resisted the earlier and massive tax and spend Build Back Better proposals. Senator Manchin pushed hard for Sinema to back the new agreement on several Sunday talk shows, claiming that it didn't raise taxes and would address their shared concerns on inflation and deficits. None of that turns out to be true. A Penn-Wharton budget model analysis shows that the bill will actually increase inflation slightly into 2024. Deficit reduction won't happen until 2027, and then only if future Congresses don't change its trajectory. The bill raises $327 billion in new taxes that hits manufacturers and other producers particularly hard. It also disincentivizes investments that could increase output and innovation, a stunning approach in a supply shock inflationary environment. Sinema should stick to her principles and reject this bill, and her constituents need to make sure she knows it. I'm Ed Morrissey. Thank you for watching and listening to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Be sure to subscribe at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube to get alerted as soon as new episodes get published. You can support the Ed Morrissey Show and Hot Air's VIP reporting by becoming a VIP member, too. Visit hotairvip.com and use the promo code SAVEAMERICA, all one word, for 40% off your membership. Choose VIP Gold and gain membership to access to all of the Town Hall sites. Thanks again for watching and listening.